The small town of Crestview, nestled deep in the heart of Wisconsin, wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. It was a quiet town, with family-run businesses lining Main Street and the soft hum of everyday life in the background. In this unassuming town, Evan Lawson ran a modest auto repair shop. Lawson's auto care had been in his family for years, passed down from his father, who had taught Evan everything he knew about cars and engines. But now, the shop was struggling, and the dream his father had built seemed to be slipping through his fingers. It was Thanksgiving evening, and while the town was buzzing with holiday cheer, families gathered around turkey-laden tables, children laughing and playing, Evan sat alone in the small office at the back of his garage. The flickering overhead light cast long shadows on the cluttered walls, filled with aging tools and repair manuals. His computer screen displayed the latest batch of unpaid bills. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and the numbers weren't adding up. Customers were few and far between, and the ones who did show up never seemed to have enough money to pay for repairs. He had already taken out 2 loans to keep the shop running, but those were rapidly being swallowed by the growing debt. As Evan leaned back in his worn-out office chair, staring at the ceiling, a sense of frustration and hopelessness washed over him. He had worked so hard to keep this place alive, but it felt like all his efforts were in vain. The shop was more than just a business to him. It was his father's legacy, a part of who he was. The thought of losing it made his stomach turn. His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was a text message from his sister, Grace. "Hey, Evan, don't forget about dinner tonight. We're waiting for you." Evan smiled faintly. Grace had always been the more optimistic one in the family, the one who could always see the bright side of things. She knew about his financial troubles, of course, but she never judged him. She just wanted him to be there for the family, to feel the warmth and support of loved ones, even if everything else felt like it was falling apart. Sighing, Evan typed back, "I'll be there soon. Just finishing up here." He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but the thought of spending time with his niece and nephew lifted his spirits. Despite his struggles, he hadn't forgotten the importance of family. He shut down his computer, grabbed his coat, and headed out into the cold. It was a clear night, the first real signs of winter settling in. The crisp air burned his lungs as he walked to his old truck, and for a moment, he could almost pretend that everything was okay. As he drove through the snow-covered streets of Crestview, the distant glow of his family's home came into view. The warm light spilling from the windows, the smell of turkey and pumpkin pie in the air. It was everything Evan had longed for. It was the kind of night that made you forget about the worries and frustrations of life. He pulled up to the driveway and parked, taking a deep breath before stepping out into the welcoming embrace of his family. "Uncle Evan." His niece, Lily, cried, running toward him as soon as he stepped through the door. Her bright eyes and joyful laugh were a welcome contrast to the weight he'd been carrying all day. His nephew, Max, followed behind, grinning mischievously. As Evan hugged them both, he felt a flicker of warmth spread through him. This was what he needed. It wasn't the food or the decorations that made Thanksgiving special. It was these moments, the laughter, the love, and the connection that grounded him. Grace led him to the dining table, where the family had already gathered. Their parents, his aging mother and father, exchanged knowing glances as Evan took his seat. They, too, had seen the signs of his struggle. They didn't ask questions, though. His mother reached across the table, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "Don't worry about the shop tonight, Evan," she said softly. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Evan managed a weak smile, but his mind was elsewhere, thinking about the bills piling up and the customers who hadn't shown up all week. He tried to push those thoughts away, focusing instead on the warmth of his family around him. It wasn't much, but tonight it felt like enough. As the evening wore on and the laughter and conversation flowed freely, Evan found himself at peace for the first time in a long while. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change, though he didn't yet know how or why. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, food, and warm, familiar conversations. Evan, despite the weight of his worries, found himself more present with his family than he'd been in months. Grace had organized the dinner, and everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. His mother, always the heart of the family, smiled softly at Evan from across the table, the lines on her face deepening with age, but never diminishing the warmth in her eyes. His father, a quiet man who had spent his life working with his hands just like Evan, sat back in his chair, taking in the laughter of his grandchildren with an approving nod. But as the evening wore on, a nagging feeling began to settle at the back of Evan's mind. His phone, which he had left in his coat pocket, buzzed on the kitchen counter. At first, he tried to ignore it, not wanting to break the moment with thoughts of his business. But the buzzing grew more insistent, pulling his attention away from the table. Excusing himself from the conversation, Evan stood up and walked over to the coat, reaching into the pocket to grab his phone. He was surprised to see that it wasn't one of his regular calls from suppliers or customers. It was an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment. It was Thanksgiving night. Who could be calling at this hour? But curiosity and a sense of duty got the better of him. He swiped the screen and answered, holding the phone to his ear. "Hello?" he said, his voice low, almost distracted. A strained, anxious voice answered from the other end. "Is this Evan Lawson? My name is Laura. I'm on Highway 51, just outside of town. My car broke down, and I've got my 2 kids with me. It's freezing out here, and I don't know what to do. Can you help?" Evan's heart skipped a beat. The urgency in Laura's voice, the panic that edged her words, made it clear that this wasn't just a simple roadside issue. He could hear the sound of wind whipping against her car, the soft cries of children in the background, and the distinct worry in her voice. For a moment, he stood still, processing the request. His mind raced, torn between staying with his family and doing what he knew was right. His shop was barely keeping afloat, and he didn't have the luxury of wasting time on non-paying jobs, especially not on a holiday. But something about the desperation in Laura's voice struck a chord deep within him. He had been where she was, stuck, desperate, and at the mercy of the cold winter night. "Where exactly are you?" Evan asked, his voice suddenly firm. "Just past the exit for Crestview, on the shoulder. The kids are cold. I don't know how much longer we can wait." Evan's stomach tightened. He glanced back toward the dinner table, where Grace was laughing with his parents, oblivious to the call. But Evan knew what he had to do. There was no question in his mind. The bills and the shop's future would still be there when he returned. Right now, someone needed him. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Evan said quickly. "Just stay in the car and keep the kids warm." Without waiting for a response, he hung up and stuffed the phone back into his coat pocket. He grabbed his keys, and just as he was about to head for the door, Grace caught sight of him. "Evan, where are you going?" she asked, her face filled with concern. "You just got here. Everything okay?" Evan hesitated for a moment, his heart torn. He didn't want to explain everything to his family, not tonight. Instead, he gave a quick smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "There's someone in need of help," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of urgency. "I'll be right back. You guys enjoy dinner. I'll catch up later." Grace opened her mouth as if to argue, but Evan didn't give her the chance. He stepped out into the cold night air and made his way to the truck, determined to do what he could for the stranger on the other end of the phone. As he drove toward the highway, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The snowstorm had started to intensify, and the roads were quickly becoming slick. His headlights cut through the thickening darkness, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. His mind was focused entirely on Laura and her children. He could only imagine the fear she must have felt, stranded on a desolate highway with nothing but the cold and the isolation surrounding her. By the time Evan reached Highway 51, the snow had begun to fall more heavily. The ground was a blur of white as he scanned the road, searching for the stranded vehicle. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A faint glow from the dim headlights of a car parked on the shoulder. He slowed down, pulling off onto the gravel, and came to a stop behind the vehicle. The outline of a woman, bundled in a thick coat, was visible through the window, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. He quickly stepped out of the truck and approached the car, his boots crunching in the snow as he walked. Laura was sitting in the front seat, her face pale and strained. Beside her were 2 small children, huddled together under a pile of blankets, their faces red from the cold. The sight hit Evan harder than he expected. The children, no older than 6 and 4, shivered uncontrollably, and Laura looked as if she hadn't slept in days. Evan knocked gently on the window. Laura looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. When she saw him, her lips parted in an almost silent sigh of relief. "You made it," she whispered. "I'm here to help," Evan said, offering a reassuring smile, though he could see the deep concern in her eyes. "Let's get you guys out of here." Evan could feel the icy wind biting at his face as he stood outside the car, the snow swirling around him in chaotic gusts. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the darkness felt deeper than it had been only a few minutes ago. He could see the worry in Laura's eyes, and it pulled at him like an invisible thread, urging him to move faster, to fix this somehow. He quickly opened the door to the car, and the cold air rushed inside. Laura shivered visibly as she unbuckled her seatbelt, turning to look at him with gratitude and a hint of fear. "You're the mechanic, right? You think you can fix it?" Laura's voice trembled, but she tried to maintain composure for her children. I'll take a look," Evan said, offering a reassuring nod. "We'll get you and the kids to a safe place soon." He glanced at the 2 children in the back seat, who were wrapped in blankets, but still appeared to be frozen with the chill of the night. The boy, a little older than his sister, had his head resting on the window, his face flushed with the cold. His sister clutched the blanket tightly, her big brown eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. Evan's heart twisted in his chest. These kids should have been at home, safe and warm, not trapped in a car on the side of the highway in a snowstorm. He turned back to Laura. "I'll need to take a look at the engine. But first, let's get you all out of this car and into my truck. I've got a heater running inside." Laura hesitated for only a moment before nodding, her shoulders sagging in relief. She knew they had no other choice. She unbuckled the children from their seats, one by one, and Evan helped her gently lead them out into the cold, wrapping them in his coat to shield them from the freezing wind. The little boy, whose name turned out to be Sam, clung to his mother's side as they all climbed into Evan's truck. His sister, Emma, had her face buried in her mother's coat, too afraid to look out at the storm. Evan helped them settle into the cab, turning the heat up as high as it would go. The warmth immediately began to work its magic, and the children relaxed, though they were still visibly cold. Evan turned back to Laura, who had taken a seat beside him in the truck. Her face was pale, and her hands shook slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. He could tell that she was doing everything she could to stay composed, but the tension was evident in her stiff posture and the way she kept glancing anxiously at the kids in the back seat. "We'll get this sorted," Evan said, more to reassure himself than anything else. He gave her a gentle smile, though he knew there were no guarantees. Laura nodded, her voice quieter now. "We were on our way to Chicago. My mom's sick, really sick. I had to get there, but..." She trailed off, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't expect this. I didn't know what to do. I just kept praying someone would stop." Evan's stomach tightened at the mention of Laura's mother. The urgency in her voice had been clear, but hearing it firsthand made it even more real. He knew what it felt like to lose someone close, to be powerless in the face of something bigger than you. His own mother had passed away years ago, leaving a hollow ache in his chest that never seemed to go away. He'd never had the chance to say goodbye, to make things right. Evan quickly forced himself to focus. This wasn't about him. This was about getting this family to safety, about making sure they got through this storm together. "You'll get to your mom," he said firmly. "I'll get you there." He started the truck and drove a little further off the highway to his shop. The snowstorm raged on, the roads becoming increasingly treacherous as visibility worsened. The tires of the truck slipped slightly on the icy roads, but Evan was a seasoned driver, and he kept a steady hand on the wheel, focusing on the path ahead. When they reached the shop, Evan parked the truck inside the garage, the snowflakes falling thick and fast outside. He turned off the engine and helped Laura and the kids out, guiding them into the warmth of the garage. The smell of oil and gasoline mixed with the scent of metal and rubber, a familiar and oddly comforting aroma. Laura led the children to a small corner of the shop, setting them up on an old couch where they could rest while Evan worked. He turned on the overhead lights, casting a soft glow across the garage, and grabbed his toolkit. He glanced back at Laura, who was sitting on a stool near her children, her worry lines deepening with each passing minute. "Stay warm in here," Evan said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll check out the car, see what we're working with." "Thank you," Laura whispered, her voice breaking slightly as she watched him. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Evan gave her a small nod, then grabbed his jacket and gloves before heading back out into the snowstorm. He walked over to the car, his boots crunching through the fresh snow, and opened the hood to examine the engine. The moment he lifted it, he knew they were in trouble. The engine was freezing, and there was a distinct rattle that told him something had gone seriously wrong. It wasn't a simple fix. This was going to take some time. He sighed, kneeling down to get a better look. The car was in worse shape than he had initially realized. A broken radiator hose, mixed with the freezing cold and the engine's inability to keep heat, had caused the engine to stall completely. The damage was significant, and it was going to take at least 3 hours of hard work to get everything back in working order. Evan's heart sank. It was late, and he knew Laura and her children were anxious to get on the road. The thought of telling her that it would take hours to fix the car didn't sit well with him. But he also knew that pushing through wasn't going to be a quick fix. He walked back into the shop, rubbing his hands together to warm them up. "It's going to take a while," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of frustration. "I'll need a couple of hours to fix this." Laura nodded, standing up. "How can we help?" she asked, her voice sincere. "You don't need to worry about that," Evan replied. "Just stay warm. I'll get you back on the road as soon as I can." He set to work, the snowstorm raging outside, but in that small garage, it was a different world, one of determination, quiet focus, and the promise of a stranger's kindness. As the hours passed, Evan worked tirelessly, feeling an increasing sense of urgency, not just because of the cold or the late hour, but because he knew Laura needed to be with her mother, and he was the one who could help make that happen. The garage was quiet, except for the occasional hum of the overhead lights and the soft clinking of tools as Evan worked. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the warmth of the shop, he was focused solely on the car. The snowstorm had intensified, a relentless white blur outside, but his thoughts were consumed by one thing: getting this family back on the road. He crouched beside the car, his breath visible in the cold air inside the garage, and examined the engine once more. The broken radiator hose had caused a cascade of issues, leading to significant damage that was far from an easy fix. Evan was no stranger to complicated repairs, but this was more than just a broken part. It was a lifeline for a family desperately trying to make it to a loved one. His hands moved efficiently, pulling out tools and replacing parts as quickly as he could. His mind raced. He didn't want to overcharge Laura, but this wasn't just about the money. It was about fixing something that could make all the difference for her. He wasn't in a position to offer charity every day, but something about this situation felt different. Maybe it was the urgency in Laura's voice or the helplessness he saw in the kid's eyes, but he felt an unexplainable pull to do everything he could. As he worked, Evan could feel his muscles aching from the strain of moving so quickly in the cold, the hours slipping by unnoticed. His movements were deliberate, even if his body was beginning to tire. There was something oddly soothing about the rhythm of fixing something, the feeling of accomplishment as each part slid into place, each bolt tightened. The engine, though battered and cold, slowly started to come back to life under his skilled hands. From the corner of his eye, Evan could see Laura occasionally glance at him from the seat where she sat with her children. She had her arms around them both, trying to keep them warm as best as she could. They hadn't spoken much in the last hour. Laura had fallen into a silent, exhausted vigilance, the weight of her mother's illness hanging over her like a dark cloud. The children were dozing off, their heads resting on their mother's lap, but Evan could tell they were still cold, still afraid. The soft sound of a child sniffling broke the silence. He glanced over to see Sam rubbing his eyes sleepily. The boy looked up at Evan, his gaze tired but curious. "Is the car going to be okay?" he asked, his voice small, almost lost in the vast emptiness of the garage. Evan wiped his brow with his sleeve and gave the boy a reassuring smile. I'm working on it, buddy. We'll get you back on the road soon. You're going to see your grandma, right? Sam nodded slowly, his little face serious. Yeah, I miss her. Mommy says she's really sick. I want to see her before it's too late. Evan's heart sank. The weight of those words, spoken so simply by a child who didn't fully understand what they meant, hit him like a physical blow. The urgency of the situation suddenly felt even heavier. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't be the reason this family didn't make it in time. Don't worry, Evan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I'm going to fix it. You're going to be there. You'll see your grandma, okay? Sam gave him a tired nod, his eyes still half-lidded. Evan's chest tightened, and he turned back to the car, not wanting the child's unspoken fear to settle in his own heart. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. He pulled out the damaged radiator and began installing a replacement part he had in stock. The snow outside had piled up to a foot, and he knew that every minute mattered. He'd hoped to wrap up the repair quickly, but the damage was worse than anticipated. It was a complex fix, and every second he spent on the engine felt like an eternity. As he worked, his thoughts began to wander, and for a brief moment, he thought about his own mother, gone now for almost a decade. She had always been his rock, the one person who made everything feel manageable, even when things got tough. Evan wasn't one to talk about his past, but sometimes, when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear, he remembered her soft smile and the way she always knew what to say to make things better. Now, as he worked tirelessly to fix a stranger's car, he realized how much he missed the feeling of being able to help someone, to be the person who made a difference in a moment of crisis. It was more than just mechanical skills. It was about showing up when it mattered most, just like his mother had always shown up for him. His focus snapped back to the car as he tightened a bolt, hearing the satisfying click of it locking into place. He wiped his hands on a rag, and for the first time in hours, allowed himself to take a breath. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Nearly 2 hours had passed since he started working on the car, and the end was finally in sight. He looked over to Laura, who was now sitting quietly, her arms still around her children. She hadn't moved much, her eyes closed in exhaustion, her lips tight with concern. Evan knew the strain she was under, her mother's illness, the weight of the cold, and the uncertainty of the journey ahead. Almost there, Evan called to her, his voice steady. Laura nodded, though she didn't say anything. She just watched him, her face softening in gratitude and wariness. Evan moved swiftly, his hands becoming accustomed to the steady rhythm of the repair. He replaced the last few parts, topped off the radiator, and tightened everything down. As the final bolt clicked into place, he let out a sigh of relief. The car wasn't just fixed, it was ready. He took a moment to admire his work before walking over to the truck to fetch his tools. The storm was still raging outside, but the lights in the shop had become a beacon of hope, of warmth in the freezing night. Okay, Laura, he said, turning to her with a smile. I think we're all set. It's not perfect, but it'll get you to Chicago. The car should hold up for the rest of the trip. Laura blinked as if she couldn't believe it. After all this time, all this waiting, it seemed impossible that they were finally on the brink of leaving. She stood up slowly, her hands still wrapped around her children. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. I don't know how to repay you. Evan shook his head, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. No need to repay me. Just get where you need to go. Take care of your family. As she walked towards the car, Evan felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The repair had been difficult, but in the end, it was worth it. Not just for the car, but for the family who needed it. Evan gave a final nod of encouragement to Laura as she climbed back into the car with her children. The snow continued to fall, but for a moment, it didn't feel so cold. He knew he'd done the right thing. He'd made a difference. And that was something that no amount of money could buy. Evan stood near the car as Laura, Mark, and the children prepared to leave. The engine hummed softly, a welcome contrast to the silence that had filled the shop moments ago. The family looked exhausted, but there was a spark of hope in their eyes now. Hope that had been missing when Evan first arrived to help. Mark approached him, extending his hand for a firm shake, His grip was strong, but his voice carried the weight of his gratitude. "Evan, I can't thank you enough. You've gone above and beyond tonight. Really, what do we owe you? Name your price." Evan glanced at the car, then back at the family. The kids were bundled up in the back seat, their small faces peeking out from under layers of blankets. Laura leaned against the passenger door, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding in all the emotions she couldn't let spill. Evan hesitated. He knew he could charge a significant amount for the work. 3 hours of labor, parts, and the emergency call. And he desperately needed the money. But looking at them, he couldn't bring himself to do it. "Let's just call it even," Evan said with a small smile. "You can cover the cost of the parts, and we'll forget the rest. Consider the labor a Thanksgiving gift." Mark's expression shifted, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. "You're serious? After all you've done?" Evan shrugged, wiping his hands on his grease-stained rag. "It's Thanksgiving. Everyone deserves a little help now and then. Besides, I'm just glad I could get you back on the road." Laura stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. She placed a trembling hand on Evan's arm. "You don't understand what this means to us. My mom, she doesn't have much time left. Because of you, we'll make it to her. You've given us more than just a repair. You've given us a chance to say goodbye." Her voice cracked, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. Evan felt a lump rise in his throat, but he forced a small smile. "That's what matters most," he said softly. Mark reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek business card, extending it toward Evan. "At least take this. If there's ever anything I can do to return the favor, don't hesitate to call. Seriously." Evan took the card, glancing at it briefly before tucking it into his pocket. He wasn't one to think much of favors or promises from strangers. People often said things in moments of gratitude that they didn't mean later. Still, he appreciated the gesture. Mark hesitated for a moment, then added, "You're a good man, Evan. I hope you know that." Evan nodded, unsure how to respond. Compliments like that didn't come his way often, and he wasn't entirely comfortable with them. He preferred actions to words. "Drive safe," he said instead, stepping back as Mark returned to the driver's seat. As the car pulled out of the garage and into the snowy night, Evan stood in the open doorway, watching the taillights fade into the distance. The cold air bit at his face, but he didn't move. His thoughts lingered on Laura's words and the way her voice had cracked with emotion. He thought about the kids, Sam and Emily, and the quiet resilience they'd shown despite the long night. Eventually, he closed the garage door and turned off the lights. The shop fell into darkness, save for the faint glow of the neon sign outside. He sat on a stool by his workbench, running a hand through his messy hair. It wasn't the Thanksgiving he had planned. No turkey dinner, no laughter with his niece and nephew. But for the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long while. Fulfillment. Digging into his pocket, he pulled out the business card Mark had given him. He glanced at the embossed letters, but the details didn't fully register. It didn't matter who Mark was or what he did for a living. What mattered was that tonight, Evan had done the right thing. Still, curiosity got the better of him. He held the card closer to the dim light. It read, "Mark Thompson, CEO, Thompson Auto Parts Midwest Division Headquarters." Evan blinked, his mind scrambling to process the title. "CEO?" He chuckled softly to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. The man he had helped wasn't just anyone. He was the head of one of the biggest auto parts manufacturers in the region. For a moment, Evan wondered what might come of this revelation, but then he dismissed the thought. It didn't change anything. He had helped a family in need, not a CEO. That was what mattered. With a sigh, he placed the card on the workbench and leaned back against the cold wall of the shop. Snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the town in silence. Evan closed his eyes, the faint hum of satisfaction settling in his chest. He hadn't made much money tonight, barely enough to cover the cost of parts, but he'd made a difference. And that, he realized, was worth more than a paycheck. For the first time in years, Evan felt like Thanksgiving truly meant something. It wasn't about feasts or family traditions. It was about kindness, about helping others when they needed it most. And tonight, that was exactly what he'd done. The next morning, sunlight poured through the small window of Evan's apartment above the garage. He stirred awake slowly, his body aching from the hours spent hunched over an engine in the freezing cold. The memory of the previous night lingered in his mind. Laura's tearful gratitude, Mark's firm handshake, the kids' sleepy, hopeful faces. Despite his exhaustion, Evan felt a rare sense of peace. He'd made a difference, even if it meant sacrificing his own plans. Pulling himself out of bed, he shuffled down to the shop. The garage was quiet, bathed in the soft morning light, and the cold air still clung to the concrete walls. Evan's gaze fell on his workbench, where tools were scattered from the late-night repair. Among the clutter sat Mark's business card, its crisp, professional design standing out like a beacon. Evan picked it up, squinting at the fine print. Mark Thompson, CEO, Thompson Auto Parts. The words seemed almost surreal. He knew Thompson Auto Parts. It was a household name in the auto repair industry, supplying parts to shops all across the Midwest. Evan had used their products countless times, but he never imagined he'd meet the man at the helm of such a massive operation. A low chuckle escaped his lips as he leaned against the workbench, holding the card between his fingers. A CEO, he murmured to himself, shaking his head. And I charged him for parts like he was just another customer. For a moment, Evan wondered what might have happened if he'd known Mark's identity the night before. Would he have acted differently? Charged more? Treated them with more formality? He shook his head again, dismissing the thought. It didn't matter who Mark was. To Evan, they'd been a family in need, and that was all that had mattered. He slipped the card into his wallet, not thinking much of it. Life went on, and Evan had a business to run, no time to dwell on what-ifs. He spent the morning cleaning up the shop, organizing tools, and preparing for the slow trickle of customers he expected during the holiday weekend. The snowfall had blanketed Crestview in white, but the streets were already being cleared, and life in the small town was returning to its usual rhythm. Just as Evan was finishing up, the shop's phone rang. He wiped his hands on a rag and picked up, expecting a customer inquiring about an oil change or a tire rotation. Lawson's Auto, he answered, his voice steady. There was a pause on the other end, then a familiar voice. Evan? This is Mark Thompson. Evan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear from Mark again, especially so soon. Mark, he said, recovering quickly. Good to hear from you. Did you make it to Chicago all right? We did, Mark replied, his tone warm. Thanks to you. My mother-in-law was so grateful to see us, and Laura, well, let's just say you've earned a lifetime of her gratitude. Evan smiled, leaning against the counter. I'm glad I could help. How's the car holding up? Running like a dream, Mark said. But that's not why I'm calling. I've been thinking a lot about what you did for us, Evan. You didn't just fix our car. You went out of your way to help strangers on Thanksgiving night. That kind of kindness isn't easy to come by. Evan felt a twinge of embarrassment. He wasn't used to receiving praise, especially not from someone like Mark. It was nothing, he said modestly. Just doing my job. No, Mark said firmly. It was more than that, and I want to talk to you about something. Do you have time to meet in person? Evan blinked, caught off guard. Sure. When were you thinking? I'm already on my way, Mark said with a laugh. Should be there in about an hour. Before Evan could process what was happening, the call ended. He stared at the phone in his hand, a mix of confusion and curiosity swirling in his mind. What could Mark possibly want to discuss? The man was a CEO with an empire to run. What business did he have in Crestview, let alone in Evan's modest garage? The hour passed quickly as Evan busied himself with cleaning up the shop, his thoughts racing. When he heard the hum of a sleek engine outside, he stepped to the window and saw a black luxury sedan pulling into the lot. Mark stepped out, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place against the backdrop of the snowy, small-town street. His confident stride and warm smile were a stark contrast to the weary man Evan had met the night before. Mark? Evan greeted as the man entered the shop, his voice tinged with both surprise and curiosity. Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Mark extended his hand for a firm shake. I'm a man of my word, Evan. I told you I'd repay you for your kindness, and I meant it. Evan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean? Mark took a moment to glance around the shop, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The worn tools, the outdated equipment, the small waiting area with its mismatched chairs. He nodded thoughtfully, then turned back to Evan. I see a lot of potential here, he said. You're not just a mechanic, Evan. You're someone who cares about people. That's rare, and it's exactly the kind of person I want to work with. Evan frowned, confused. Work with? I'm not sure I follow. Mark smiled, pulling out a folder from his briefcase. Thompson Auto Parts is expanding, and we're looking to partner with independent shops like yours. I want Lawson's Auto to be the first. We'll provide funding for renovations, new equipment, and training for your staff. In return, you'll carry our parts exclusively and represent our brand. Evan's jaw dropped. He stared at Mark, unable to believe what he was hearing. You're serious? Completely, Mark said. This isn't just about business, Evan. It's about rewarding integrity and hard work. You've built something special here, and I want to help you take it to the next level. For a moment, Evan was speechless. The offer was almost too good to be true. A lifeline for his struggling business, a chance to finally get ahead. But it wasn't just about the money or the opportunity. It was about the validation, the recognition of his values and efforts. Why me? He finally asked. There are plenty of shops out there. Why choose mine? Mark's expression softened. Because you remind me of myself, Evan. When I was starting out, I had nothing but determination and a willingness to help others. You gave my family a gift last night, and now I want to give you one in return. Evan swallowed hard, the weight of the moment settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. His life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. Evan sat at his small desk in the corner of the shop, staring at the open folder Mark had handed him. Inside were glossy printouts detailing the partnership program, financial projections, and a detailed plan for upgrading Lawson's Auto. The figures were staggering. Renovation budgets, top-of-the-line equipment, and marketing support that would have been unthinkable just a day ago. It was everything his business needed and more. Across from him, Mark sat casually in a folding chair, his suit as crisp as if he had just walked out of a boardroom. Despite his polished appearance, his demeanor was relaxed, almost humble, as if he knew the enormity of his offer and wanted to give Evan time to process it. So, Mark began, his voice breaking the heavy silence. What do you think? Evan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to think, he admitted with a nervous laugh. It's a lot. I mean, it sounds incredible, but why would you do this for me? We barely know each other. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You're right. We don't know each other well, but I know enough to see the kind of man you are. You didn't have to stop and help us last night, Evan. You could have ignored that call and gone to your family dinner. But you didn't. You put your own plans aside to help strangers in need. That kind of integrity is rare. And when I see someone like you, someone with that kind of heart, I don't just see a mechanic, I see a partner. Evan felt his chest tighten at the sincerity in Mark's voice. He wasn't used to being recognized like this, let alone by someone so successful. It's just a lot to take in, he said finally. I mean, this place has been my whole life. It's not much, but it's mine. And the idea of changing it, even for something better, it's scary. Mark nodded, his expression understanding. I get that. Change is never easy, especially when it's something you've built from the ground up. But think about what this could mean, not just for you, but for your community. With our support, you'll be able to serve more people, hire more staff, and create something that lasts. Evan glanced around the shop, his eyes lingering on the old tools and worn-out equipment. He thought about the nights he had stayed late, working on cars to keep the lights on. He thought about the customers who had trusted him despite the peeling paint on the walls and the outdated machinery. This place was more than a business. It was a part of him. But it was also a constant struggle. And he couldn't deny that the opportunity Mark was offering could change everything. Mark seemed to sense his hesitation. Look, I'm not asking for an answer right now. Take some time to think about it. Talk to your family, your friends, whoever you trust. But know this, I'm not just offering you a business deal. I'm offering you a chance to grow, to make a real impact, and I'll be with you every step of the way. Evan nodded slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't help but wonder what his late father would have thought of this. His dad had been a mechanic too, a man who believed in hard work and honest living. Evan had inherited his father's tools, his shop, and his values. But would his father have taken a leap like this? Or would he have stuck to the old ways, no matter how difficult they were? Before Evan could spiral further into his thoughts, Mark stood and extended his hand. No pressure, Evan. Just think about it. And whatever you decide, know that I'm grateful for what you did for my family. That won't change. Evan shook Mark's hand, the strength in the gesture grounding him. Thank you, he said quietly. I'll think about it. As Mark left the shop, his sleek car disappearing down the snowy road, Evan felt the weight of the decision settle over him. This wasn't just about his business. It was about his identity, his future, and the kind of man he wanted to be. That evening, Evan drove out to his sister Grace's house, needing her perspective. The warm glow of her kitchen was a welcome contrast to the cold night, and the smell of leftover Thanksgiving pie filled the air. Grace was sitting at the table, her kids playing in the next room, when Evan laid out the folder and explained everything. Grace listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. When Evan finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression a mix of pride and concern. This is huge, Evan. I mean, it sounds like a dream come true, but it's also a big responsibility. Are you ready for something like this? I don't know, Evan admitted. I've been struggling to keep this place afloat for so long, and now here's this opportunity that could change everything. But it's scary. What if I mess it up? What if it's too much? Grace reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on his. Evan, you've already proven what kind of man you are. You put others before yourself, even when it's hard. That's what makes you special. And if anyone can handle this, it's you. But you have to believe in yourself. Her words stayed with Evan as he drove back to the shop that night. He spent hours pacing the garage, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and hope. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, he made his decision. The next day, Evan picked up the phone and called Mark. When the familiar voice answered, Evan took a deep breath and said, I'm in. Let's do this. Mark's laughter echoed through the line, filled with genuine excitement. You won't regret this, Evan. This is the start of something amazing. As Evan hung up, he felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in years, the future didn't seem like a battle to survive. It felt like a path to something greater. The weeks following Evan's decision to partner with Thompson Auto Parts were a whirlwind of activity. For years, Lawson's Auto had been a modest operation, held together by Evan's hard work and determination. But now, the shop was buzzing with a level of energy and excitement Evan had never experienced before. The transformation began almost immediately. Mark's team of contractors arrived in Crestview within days, bringing with them an impressive array of tools, equipment, and expertise. Evan watched in awe as the old, cracked concrete floors were replaced with polished, durable surfaces. The peeling walls were repainted in sleek, professional tones of gray and blue, accented with the Thompson Auto Parts logo. The outdated machinery that had been the backbone of Evan's work was replaced with cutting-edge equipment, hydraulic lifts, computerized diagnostic tools, and even a tire balancing machine that Evan had only dreamed of owning. The biggest change, however, was the waiting area. What had once been a cramped space with mismatched chairs and a small coffee pot now became a comfortable, welcoming lounge. Plush seating, a flat-screen TV, and even a coffee station were installed, transforming the space into something that felt more like a high-end dealership than a small-town repair shop. Evan couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions as he watched his shop evolve. On one hand, he was thrilled to see Lawson's Auto get the upgrade it so desperately needed. On the other hand, he worried about losing the personal touch that had defined his business. Would his loyal customers still feel at home here? Would they see this new, polished version of the shop and think it had lost its heart? Mark seemed to sense Evan's unease during one of his visits. Dressed in a casual sweater and slacks, far less intimidating than his usual suit, he stood beside Evan in the newly renovated shop, surveying the changes. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? Mark said, his tone understanding. Evan nodded, his arms crossed. It's amazing, no doubt about that, but it's also different. I've always prided myself on being approachable, you know? Just a guy who works hard and does right by people. I don't want to lose that. Mark smiled, clapping Evan on the shoulder. You won't. The heart of this place is you, Evan. The fancy equipment, the new paint, it's all just tools. What makes Lawson's Auto special is the way you treat people, and that's something no renovation can change. Evan let Mark's words sink in, and for the first time, he began to feel a sense of pride in the transformation. This wasn't just about making the shop look better. It was about giving him the resources to do what he loved even better than before. The grand reopening of Lawson's Auto was scheduled for the first week of December, and the entire town of Crestview was invited. Flyers were distributed, and Mark's marketing team ensured that the event would be a celebration to remember. On the day of the reopening, Evan stood outside the shop, marveling at the changes. A brand new sign hung above the entrance, reading, "Lawson's Auto Care, a Thompson Automotive Partner," in bold, sleek lettering. It was a strange feeling, seeing his name paired with such a well-known brand. But it also felt right, like a bridge between his humble beginnings and the promising future ahead. As the event began, customers, neighbors, and even strangers filled the shop. Families wandered through the gleaming garage, marveling at the new equipment, while children enjoyed hot chocolate and cookies provided by Mark's team. Evan's sister, Grace, and her kids were there, beaming with pride as they watched him greet the crowd. Laura and her family also made an appearance, and when she saw Evan, she hugged him tightly. "This is incredible," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You deserve all of this, Evan. You've earned it." Mark gave a short speech during the event, praising Evan's hard work and integrity. "What you see here today isn't just a business. It's a testament to what happens when we invest in good people," Mark said. "Evan didn't just fix my car that night. He reminded me of the kind of values this industry should stand for: honesty, kindness, and community." When it was Evan's turn to speak, he felt a lump form in his throat. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, but as he looked out at the crowd, his family, friends, and customers, he felt a wave of gratitude that gave him strength. "I never imagined something like this would happen," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "For years, this shop has been my life. It hasn't always been easy, but it's been worth it because of the people I've been able to help. To see it transformed like this, it's more than I could have dreamed. But I want you all to know that no matter how shiny the floors are or how fancy the tools get, this will always be a place where you're treated like family. That's something I promise will never change." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time in a long time, Evan felt truly at peace. This wasn't just a new chapter for Lawson's Auto. It was a new chapter for him. In the weeks that followed, the shop flourished. Customers came not only from Crestview, but from neighboring towns, drawn by the shop's reputation for honest, high-quality work. Evan hired 2 new mechanics, both of whom were thrilled to work with the state-of-the-art equipment. Despite the increased workload, Evan made it a point to interact with every customer, ensuring that the personal touch that had defined his business remained intact. One snowy afternoon, Laura and her kids stopped by with a tin of homemade cookies. "We just wanted to thank you again," she said, smiling warmly. "You didn't just fix our car that night. You gave us hope. And seeing what you've done here, it's clear that you're giving hope to so many others too." Evan accepted the cookies with a grin, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Laura. But honestly, you and your family have done more for me than you know. That night, it reminded me why I started this in the first place." As Laura and her kids left, Evan looked around the shop, now bustling with activity. He couldn't help but smile. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. Not alone, but with a community that believed in him as much as he believed in them. As the weeks turned into months, Lawson's Auto Care became more than just a thriving business. It became a cornerstone of the Crestview community. Evan had always believed in the importance of treating people with kindness and fairness, but now, with the resources at his disposal, he found new ways to extend those values beyond the walls of his shop. One chilly morning, Evan was sipping coffee in the newly renovated office when an idea struck him. It had been inspired by something Laura had said during her last visit: how overwhelming it was for struggling families to face unexpected car repairs. He remembered his own struggles to keep his shop running, how every unexpected expense felt like a mountain to climb. Now that he was in a position to help, he knew he had to do something. Evan reached out to Mark with a proposal, a program to assist low-income families with the cost of car repairs. The idea was simple but impactful. Lawson's Auto Care would cover the labor costs for qualifying families, and Mark, through Thompson Auto Parts, would match the cost of the parts. Together, they could create a safety net for people in need. Mark was immediately on board. "This is exactly why I wanted to partner with you, Evan," he said during their call. "You're not just running a business, you're building a legacy. Let's make it happen." The program, called Wheels of Hope, launched quietly at first, with flyers posted around Crestview and nearby towns. Evan didn't expect much fanfare, but within days, the shop was inundated with calls and visits from families who desperately needed help. Single mothers, elderly couples, and young parents struggling to make ends meet came through the doors, their stories often heartbreaking. One of the first families to benefit from the program was the Rodriguez family. Maria Rodriguez, a widow with 3 children, had been relying on an old, unreliable van to get her kids to school and herself to work. When the van broke down completely, she thought she'd have to quit her job. When she arrived at Lawson's Auto, her face was etched with worry. Evan personally greeted Maria, listening to her story as his team inspected the van. "We'll take care of it," he assured her, his voice steady and kind. "You don't need to worry." The repair was extensive, requiring hours of work and several expensive parts. But when Maria nervously asked about the cost, Evan simply smiled. "It's covered under Wheels of Hope," he said. "You don't owe us anything." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she hugged Evan tightly. "You don't know what this means to me," she whispered. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Word of Wheels of Hope spread quickly, and soon the shop was featured in local newspapers and on community bulletin boards. Reporters interviewed Evan, eager to learn about the man behind the initiative. When asked why he started the program, Evan's response was simple. "I know what it's like to struggle, to feel like the odds are stacked against you. If I can make someone's life a little easier, even for a day, it's worth it." The program gained even more momentum when Mark announced that Thompson Auto Parts would match every dollar Evan contributed, effectively doubling the reach of Wheels of Hope. Together, they helped dozens of families in the first few months alone, with stories of gratitude pouring in from all over the region. But for Evan, the most rewarding moments weren't in the headlines or the thank you letters. They were in the quiet, personal interactions he had with the people he helped. Like the time an elderly man named Frank came in with a car so old and battered that Evan doubted it could even be fixed. Frank explained that he needed the car to visit his wife in a nursing home, and without it, he couldn't see her. Evan didn't hesitate. He and his team worked late into the night, patching up the car as best they could. When Frank came to pick it up the next day, his hands trembled as he tried to pay. "This one's on us, Frank," Evan said, his voice firm but warm. "Go see your wife." Frank's gratitude was written all over his face, and as he drove away, Evan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Moments like these reminded him why he had started Wheels of Hope in the first place. As the program grew, Evan began to think about how he could involve the community in a more meaningful way. He organized fundraising events, inviting local businesses and residents to contribute to Wheels of Hope. The response was overwhelming. People donated generously, some offering money and others volunteering their time to help with repairs. One memorable event was a winter car wash fundraiser. Despite the freezing temperatures, dozens of people showed up to support the cause, including Grace and her kids, who eagerly helped wash cars alongside Evan's team. The sight of the community coming together warmed Evan's heart, even as he stood shivering in the cold. By the end of the fundraiser, they had raised enough money to cover repairs for 10 more families. "This isn't just my program anymore," Evan said during a speech at the event. "It's ours. Every one of you is a part of Wheels of Hope, and together, we're making a difference." The impact of Wheels of Hope extended beyond the families it helped. It inspired other businesses in Crestview to start their own community initiatives, creating a ripple effect of kindness and generosity. Local schools began organizing food drives, and a nearby pharmacy launched a discount program for low-income seniors. Evan's small act of giving back had sparked a movement that transformed the town. One day, as Evan was locking up the shop after another busy day, he paused to take it all in. The renovated space, the bustling activity, the smiling faces of his team. It was everything he had dreamed of and more. But what meant the most to him was knowing that his shop was now a symbol of hope for the community. As he turned off the lights and stepped outside, the winter air crisp against his face, Evan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road to this moment hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every struggle, every sleepless night, and he knew that the best was yet to come. 3 years later, the small town of Crestview looked remarkably different, and much of that change could be traced back to Evan Lawson and his once humble auto repair shop. Lawson's Auto Care had become a thriving enterprise, with 10 locations spread across Wisconsin, each one upholding the same principles that Evan had built his life upon: honesty, kindness, and a commitment to helping those in need. Evan stood in the doorway of his original shop, now a flagship location. The winter sun glinted off the freshly painted sign that bore his name alongside Thompson Auto Parts, a reminder of how far he had come. Inside, the shop hummed with activity. Mechanics bustled about, working on cars, chatting with customers, and occasionally stopping to joke with Evan. The sense of camaraderie was palpable, and it filled Evan with pride. The success of his business, however, wasn't what brought him the greatest satisfaction. It was the impact of Wheels of Hope, the program he had started 3 years ago. What began as a small initiative had grown into a statewide network, helping thousands of families keep their vehicles running. Evan had even partnered with other businesses and nonprofits to expand the program's reach, ensuring that no family in need was left stranded. On Thanksgiving morning, Evan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. As he sipped his coffee, memories of that fateful Thanksgiving 3 years ago flooded his mind. The desperate phone call from Laura, the snowstorm, and the long hours spent repairing her car. He thought of how one act of kindness had set off a chain reaction that had changed his life forever. The tradition of giving back on Thanksgiving had become a cornerstone of Lawson's Auto Care. Every year, Evan and his team volunteered their time to offer free labor to stranded travelers or those in need of urgent car repairs. It was their way of paying forward the blessings they had received, and it had become one of the most anticipated events of the year. This Thanksgiving was no different. The shop was abuzz with activity as Evan's team prepared for the day. Grace and her children had arrived early, eager to help. Grace, now a co-organizer of Wheels of Hope, had become one of Evan's biggest supporters. Her kids, now teenagers, had grown up watching their uncle turn his small-town garage into a beacon of hope, and they were proud to pitch in whenever they could. As the first customers of the day trickled in, Evan greeted each one with a warm smile and a handshake. Some were familiar faces, longtime residents of Crestview who had supported him from the beginning. Others were strangers, their expressions a mix of relief and gratitude as they realized they wouldn't have to worry about how to afford their car repairs. One of the customers that morning was a young single father named Adam. His car, an old sedan, had broken down on his way to deliver Thanksgiving dinner to his elderly parents. Adam explained his situation with a tinge of embarrassment, but Evan quickly put him at ease. "Don't worry about a thing," Evan said, clapping Adam on the shoulder. "We'll take care of it." As the mechanics got to work, Adam sat in the waiting area, sipping a cup of coffee. Evan joined him, asking about his family and learning that Adam worked 2 jobs to provide for his son. By the time the car was fixed, Adam looked visibly more relaxed. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You just did," Evan replied with a smile. "Take care of your family. That's thanks enough." Later that evening, as the sun set and the team began cleaning up, Mark arrived at the shop. Despite his busy schedule, Mark always made it a point to visit on Thanksgiving, a reminder of the night that had brought their lives together. He stood beside Evan, watching the mechanics finish up. "You've built something incredible here," Mark said, his tone filled with admiration. "This isn't just a business, Evan, it's a legacy." Evan chuckled softly, his eyes scanning the shop. "It doesn't feel like work most days. It feels like, I don't know, like this is what I was always meant to do." Mark nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Not everyone gets to say that, and not everyone uses success the way you have. You've changed lives, Evan, including mine." As the evening wound down, the team gathered for a small Thanksgiving dinner in the shop. They shared stories, laughter, and gratitude, the warmth of their camaraderie making the chilly winter night feel far away. Evan looked around the table, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. These weren't just his colleagues, they were his family. In the years that followed, Evan's influence only grew. Lawson's Auto Care became a model for ethical business practices, inspiring other companies to adopt similar initiatives. Wheels of Hope expanded into neighboring states, bringing relief and hope to countless families. Evan himself became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story at conferences and community events. But despite the recognition and accolades, Evan remained the same humble mechanic who believed in doing the right thing. Every Thanksgiving, Evan made it a point to return to the original shop in Crestview, where it had all begun. He would stand in the doorway, watching the snowfall, and reflect on the journey that had brought him there. He often thought about Laura and her family, wondering if they ever realized just how much they had changed his life. For Evan, the greatest reward wasn't in the success of his business or the recognition he received. It was in the lives he had touched, and the knowledge that his small act of kindness had set off a ripple effect of generosity and goodwill. As he stood outside the shop one Thanksgiving evening, watching the snow blanket the quiet streets of Crestview, Evan felt a profound sense of peace. He had built more than a business. He had built a legacy of kindness, one that would endure for generations to come. And in his heart, he knew that this was the true measure of success. Evan Lawson's journey began in the shadows of hardship, with a future that seemed uncertain. Yet it was his kindness and unwavering sincerity that unlocked doors he never imagined. From a struggling mechanic in a small town, Evan became a beacon of generosity, a living reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion can ignite monumental change. Evan's story is a testament to the power of giving without expectation. His determination, empathy, and faith in the goodness of others turned his life around and inspired countless others along the way. What started as a single act of kindness on a snowy Thanksgiving night blossomed into a legacy that touched hearts and uplifted lives far beyond the borders of Crestview. Each winter, as snow gently blankets the town, the lights of Lawson's Auto Care continue to shine brightly, not just as a place for repairing cars, but as a symbol of hope and humanity. Evan wasn't just fixing vehicles. He was mending lives, building connections, and proving that every act of kindness carries infinite value. This story of resilience and compassion closes with a simple yet profound truth. Miracles don't always come from grand gestures. They often stem from the smallest moments when we choose to do the right thing. In those moments, we not only change the lives of others, but also transform our own. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through Evan Lawson's story. We hope his tale of kindness, perseverance, and transformation has touched your heart as much as it did ours. If you enjoyed the story and found inspiration in it, we'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more uplifting content. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue to bring stories that inspire and motivate. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Once again, thank you for being a part of this journey, and we look forward to sharing more with you soon.